We've all heard something about this word right here, insulin. You've likely heard this being thrown around online. You likely have some understanding that insulin has some level of significance, importance when it comes to fat loss, but you don't quite understand how it works. What we're going to do in this video is we're going to break down the common belief systems, the common myths, and how insulin actually affects the body, how it works, and how we can overcome our issue related to insulin and therefore make fat loss inevitable. So the first thing which we need to understand is, what is insulin's role within the body? Insulin is essentially the master fat storing hormone. It is the hormone which will allow your body to store body fat, or in contrary, not store body fat, right? And that relies heavily on the balance between two things, which is insulin sensitivity and, bad spelling, and insulin resistance. And one thing which I want you to understand just from the offset is that insulin sensitivity and insulin resistance, they're not two checkpoints, but instead there is a distance between them that is like a gauge, right? So you're never quite insulin sensitive and you're never insulin resistant. People think that they're definitive locations and areas within health, but you're never ever one or the other. You're just slightly more one than the other, okay? And when you're insulin resistant, it basically means that the cells in your body have become resistant to uptaking that glucose. So this brings me on to my next point, is actually understanding how insulin works and how we can unlock certain levels of insulin sensitivity and resistance. And the most simple analogy when it comes to understanding how insulin works is insulin is essentially the hormone which will allow the cells, so that you've got to imagine that this is a cell in the body, to uptake glucose, right? Insulin's role within the body is to allow glucose to enter within the cell, because that's what allows to give the cell energy, right, and fuel. Your body does primarily use glucose as fuel. It can use something called ketones, which is a video for a whole other day. But we're going to use this one for an example. Insulin is the key which allows the cell to uptake glucose that comes in through the body. And the first belief system which I want you to break from the offset is that glucose is not carbs. We often think that carbohydrates are glucose, and to some extent that is true. So then what we do when we think, oh, we've got to lower insulin levels, we'll just lower glucose. We'll just stop taking in carbohydrates, and that's what's going to fix our insulin-related issue. And that's not the case, because what glucose actually is the fuel in which the cells in which your body want to utilize, especially when it comes to high-intense activity. So whenever you go to do any form of exercise or training, which involves getting your heart rate elevated, which involves pushing your muscles, your body wants to use glucose, right? It is the most efficient form of energy for your body to use, the efficient fuel system for your body to use when it comes to that performance. So what will your body do if you take carbohydrates out? Well, what it will do is it will use the protein and fat in your body, convert those over through a process called gluconeogenesis into available glucose, so then your body can start this process all over again. That's why some of you, when you've tried to remove carbohydrates from your diet and gone, I'm still insulin resistant, this is why. Because now what you're actually doing is you're letting your body go through a process which it's not all too efficient at to get glucose, and then put that into the cells. And what this does as a byproduct, gluconeogenesis, is it increases cortisol, right? It's essentially like going, I can get a well of water, I can get water through consuming, or I can get water through going to a well, reeling it up and then consuming it. Like, the more efficient one is just to drink the water you've got in your hand. That is essentially how gluconeogenesis works. So that's our first common belief system broken down. But back onto the insulin part. What happens over time is the cell will become less responsive to glucose, because your insulin will either become more resistant or less sensitive. So when your body is something called insulin sensitive, it basically means that your uptake of glucose to the cell is going to be very, very efficient, right? It's going to be moving at an extraordinary rate, right? Your body's going to love it. When you're insulin sensitive, you tend to be very lean, right? Your body tends to use fuel very, very efficiently. When you're insulin sensitive, however, this process is very, very slow. Which brings me on to the next part of this, which is blood sugars and insulin levels. So what happens when you consume food, right? Or any form of carbohydrate, and the same through that process, gluconeogenesis, is your blood sugars. In fact, I'm going to use a different diagram to make this easier for you. These are your blood sugars. When you consume glucose, your body goes like this. At this point, your body will release insulin from the pancreas in order to drop your blood sugar levels back to baseline. Had we not had insulin, what would happen is your blood sugars would stay like this, right? And they stay heightened. And we all know the issues with having heightened levels of blood sugar. You run into a bunch of health implications with that. So insulin's role is essentially to lower blood sugar levels back to baseline. Sometimes it can go slightly lower. Okay? When you become insulin resistant, it basically means that your cell is not able to uptake that glucose within its system, right? So your insulin, your blood sugar levels stay elevated, right? When your blood sugar levels are elevated, you're going to experience hunger. You're going to experience tiredness. You're going to experience crashes of energy, because that's what will happen when blood sugar eventually does come crashing down. And as a byproduct, this is a really unproductive state for the body to be in, right? Because your body will still produce insulin, but your body and your cells are not able to uptake that insulin. So then what happens is, when your insulin levels are elevated, you're in something called fat storing mode. Because insulin is a fat storing hormone. When you've got insulin present within your bloodstream, it basically means that your body is going to take whatever fuel comes into it, store that as fat. It will store that glycogen as fat, right? And where people get themselves in a pickle is insulin levels are elevated, their body is in fat storing mode, and their cells are resistant, so they're not uptaking this glucose, allowing those blood sugars to come back down into a normal level. This is where people's issue with fat gain starts, because their body is not able to utilize that fuel source correctly. It's got nothing to do with the fact that they're eating too much. It's to do with the fact that the body can't use the food in which it's giving it effectively and efficiently. And that's why insulin resistance is the number one issue when it comes to fat loss, right? Because if you're insulin resistant, it means that your body is not able to use that fuel properly. So no matter what you put in the body, no matter how many calories you put in, you're very much going to struggle to lose fat. And then what it does also is, let's say you do go on a calorie restrictive diet, but your blood sugars are still elevated, you're going to experience extreme hunger, extreme tiredness, and then extreme cravings, which your body will then not be able to use, right? Because the reason why your body signals cravings is because it wants energy. Because when your insulin levels are elevated, your body cannot gain energy because it doesn't have access to the food in which you're giving it. Your body essentially, your cells essentially say, I'm starving. I don't have access to food. Because when insulin levels are elevated, these are elevated levels of blood sugar, also elevated levels of insulin, right? This is the following problem. Your body cannot go through a process called lipolysis. Lipolysis is where it uses the fat on your body for fuel, okay? So this is where fat loss is an interesting dynamic, because your body wants to go into lipolysis in order to use that fat in which you're looking to shift. However, if your insulin levels are elevated because you're giving your body glucose and it can't access that as a fuel, it can also then go into lipolysis. So you get to the point where your body is just essentially in this fat storing state, and this is how people get themselves overweight very, very quickly, because they've got an insulin related issue. So hopefully that explains why this process happens, right? And how catastrophic it is for fat loss. So what we need to do is lower insulin levels, because if we can lower insulin, we can lower fat storing, and what we can start doing is going into a process called lipolysis. We can increase lipolysis, therefore we can use the fuel in our body for available energy. Okay, it's a very, very simple process. It sounds complicated, that's absolutely not. Okay, you go lower insulin, lower blood sugar levels, lower fat storing mode, increase lipolysis, increase using the fat for fuel. It's actually really, really simple. The problem comes down to then how we do that. Right, and this is where everyone else gets themselves in that cycle where, like I said, they take all the carbohydrates out and they go, yeah, this is how I'm going to reset my insulin levels, but they don't realize that their body goes through the process of gluconeogenesis, which we spoke about, where their body then has to convert fat and protein over into glucose, therefore you still have an insulin-related issue, okay? So that's not going to work, as we've broken down in this video. Another concept which I want to break down for you is something called the Randall cycle. And this is where people get themselves even furtherly in a pickle, and where the majority of insulin-related issues come from. I will say, before I break into the Randall cycle, I believe that the number one issue related to increased insulin-related levels, and I'd actually say the number one problem when it comes to insulin is high cortisol, because cortisol is stress. When you elicit stress on a body, whether that be physical or psychological, your body will produce the hormone cortisol. Cortisol also increases your insulin levels, right? And when your insulin levels are increased, your body's more likely to store fat. That's why I believe that number one issue is cortisol. However, one issue which people do run themselves into is something called the Randall cycle. There are so many nuances of the Randall cycle, so I'm going to break it down as simply as I can. In essence, your body has an issue utilizing either carbs or fat for fuel, because your body can either utilize the fat on your body that you consume through a process called ketosis, lipolysis, or it can be in carb mode, where it uses carbohydrate metabolism, it uses carbs primarily for its fuel source. What happens when you get yourself stuck within the Randall cycle is your body doesn't know which one to use, right? And what ends up happening is blood sugar levels stay elevated because your body doesn't know which one to use. And this is why processed food is awful when it comes to losing fat and regulating the insulin, because processed food typically tends to be greasy, sugary food, right? Food that is high in carb, also high in fat. Now that's an issue, right? Because what happens is, if you push carbohydrates in, at least then your body can use insulin to lower those as quickly as possible, right? However, if you're consuming high sugar with high fat, you get a very, 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 very slow release of that sugar into the bloodstream. So then what happens is you have elevated insulin levels for a prolonged period of time. A longer period of time in which your body can store food directly as fat. And that's where the issue with the Randall cycle begins. So what you want to do when it comes to this process is work out which fuel system do I want to utilize primarily. You can't use both. It becomes largely inefficient to use both because you'll run into the issue with fuel utilization, okay? You can get better at this as you get leaner and get more insulin sensitive, and what you start to become is something called more metabolically adapt. But that's a process down the line. What you want to do first is work out which fuel system do I want to use, carbs or fat. Now, there are pros and cons to both, okay? But essentially what we want to do is, when we're running either of these, is we want to use higher carbs and low fat. So you want to be using around 40 to 50 grams of fat, or low carbs, high fat, where you can use 100 grams plus of fat a day and sub 50, sub 75 grams of carbs a day. That's how you put your body into fat burning mode. I would always resort to carbohydrates over fats, for the main reason that if you're trying to build a lean, performative body, you're going to want to be training, you're going to be wanting to build muscle. Carbs are superior for training performance. Higher increased levels in training performance, the more muscle you're going to have, the more efficient and effective your body is. Carbs are also, I'm going to just put that down here. Carbs are also amazing for lowering cortisol, because what carbohydrates do is they fuel for that performance, but they also allow to replace glycogen afterwards. Therefore, your body doesn't have to go through the process of gluconeogenesis, which takes a long period of time. You also have the argument that carbohydrates are better for increasing your thyroid, and your thyroid is largely responsible for your metabolic rate within the body. Okay, so you've got the pros of carbs. The pros of fats are that you're more likely to have stable blood sugars, but that's after you've broken the Randall cycle. It's more satiating. If you have a high fat diet, you typically you can fast for longer periods of time, so it's more satiating. And one would argue that the high fat diet has slightly more nutrients, slightly more nutrient dense. You're going to get more omega-3s, omega-6. You're going to get a healthy balance of the two. You're going to get more essential fatty acids. However, I have tried both. I've tried a high fat diet, I've tried a high carb diet. I always look and feel better on a high carb diet. My body looks better, I'm leaner, I'm performing at a much higher level because I'm giving my body more available glycogen, which it needs to perform at a high capacity. And that's why I say to everyone when they're looking to lose fat, is we want to go for this option right here, because most physiques in which you've seen, most physiques in which you idolize, they're built primarily off of carbs. And the few people that go by the logic that, oh, my physique was built largely off of fats, they've usually done a high carb diet before, then swapped over to fats and then claimed that the fats is what's done the work in the first place. It doesn't work like that. The majority of the work for most people is done through a high carbohydrate diet. You break the Randall cycle, you put your body into carbohydrate burning mode, you stop the issue with fuel consumption, the body primarily relies off of carbs. So that's what step you want to do. I'm making it sound very complicated, so I hope that you're following me. Okay. So how exactly are we going to go through the process of lowering insulin levels? You're having an issue regulating your insulin. Well, I've already broken down what you want to do food-wise. You want to swap over to a primarily carbohydrate diet, but you want to start low with this. Because if you start too high, let's say you go straight in at 250 grams of carbs a day, your body very, very likely isn't going to be able to make use of that too quickly. So what we want to do is start low, 150 grams of carbs a day, and then slowly increase it. But like I said, this only works if you get the other things in check. So in order to remove the insulin resistance, the first thing which you primarily want to get in order is your cortisol. You want to be lowering stress levels within your body. A large part of that is step 2, which is improving sleep. Sleep is the foundation for health. It's the foundation for building muscle. It's the foundation for improving every single facet of your physical and mental life, right? And particularly when it comes to insulin, sleep is the #1 modulator for lowering those insulin levels. The better you sleep, the more likely it is your insulin is going to be in a better place, because sleep also helps regulate cortisol. It also helps regenerate and rejuvenate hormones, which are going to work in perfect synchronicity with lowering insulin, okay? Sleep, that's key. 8 to 9 hours. 2 to 3 hours of deep sleep a night. That's a non-negotiable. You can't pass this step. If you try and bypass this, you will lose. Like I said, you want to slowly reverse diet and give your body more food. You're also going to want to have somewhat of a high output. 10,000 steps a day. And weight training 3 to 4 times per week. And when I say training, I actually mean training. I actually mean progressively getting stronger. Not just going through the motion. You're actively improving. You're increasing performance week in, week out. If you're doing this, you're increasing the food, you're lowering your insulin. There's no point in doing that if you're not going to progress your weight training. It becomes a waste of time. So you have to make sure that you're increasing that, okay? There's plenty of other things you can do. You can look down the supplementation route. You can take your berberine. You can take your magnesium glycinate. Down the medical route, you can obviously look into retatrutide, which is a peptide. You don't need to do those things. You don't need to worry about supplementation. When you get these things in check, when you get your cortisol to a good place, when you run a carefully curated reverse diet, when you get your sleep to a good spot, when you start increasing your output and lifting weights, this will shift your body into the carbohydrate metabolism. It will lower your insulin levels. You reduce that metabolic issue which you're having, whether to use fat for fuel or carbs for fuel. And your insulin issue will go away. And then what you'll start to find is you're eating more food. You're not battling issues with energy, issues with crashes throughout the day, issues with cravings, because cravings, like we said, primarily come from insulin, okay? So if we lower those insulin levels through that process in which I've mentioned to you, you will ultimately be able to lose fat, right? And you won't have any issues. The one thing that I would say, like I said, if you don't plan on lifting weights, you just want to be skinny, you don't plan on you don't plan on building much muscle, you don't want to get too strong, you can lower your insulin levels by going for a fat-based diet, which is primarily an animal-based diet. And still for this, I would average 8 to 10,000 steps per day, around 60 to 80 grams of fat per day. You're gonna have to go ultra high protein, so you're gonna have to go 180 grams to 200 grams of protein per day. And no intense training. And still obviously improve the other variables, cortisol, sleep. If you do not do these things and you still eat a high fat-based diet, you will run into an insulin resistance. And if you start cheating on your fat-based diet by eating more carbohydrates, that will also run you into the issues of the Randall cycle even further, okay? So if you want to take that route, you can take that route. But like I said, I would advise the carbohydrate route for anybody looking to build a very impressive physique, because you won't be able to do it without it. That's insulin, that's how it works. Any questions you've got, please feel free to message me over on Instagram or in the comment section. Master this, you'll master fat loss. You will never have a problem ever again.